You're listening to The Reclaimed Life, a podcast about recognizing manipulation, reclaiming your voice, and rebuilding a life that actually feels like your own. I'm Rachel Paxton, an author, ordained chaplain, and certified mental health coach. And each week I'll explore the patterns, dynamics, and turning points that help people rediscover who they truly are. One of the hardest things to accept is that not every story gets a satisfying ending. Not every relationship ends with honesty. Not every wound receives an apology, and not every question gets answered. And not every person is willing or able to give us the closure we're hoping for. In today's episode, we're talking about what happens when closure never comes, why we stay stuck waiting for explanations, accountability, or understanding, and how healing sometimes begins when we stop waiting for someone else to give us what they may never be able to provide. There's a question many people carry for years. Why? Why did they do that? Why did they change? Why did they say one thing and do another? Why did they leave? Why did they stay? Why didn't they tell the truth? Why won't they talk about it? Why won't they acknowledge what happened? For many people, healing gets delayed because they're waiting for an answer, an explanation, an apology, a conversation, a moment where everything finally makes sense. And sometimes those things happen, but often they don't. One of the hardest realities of life is that closure is not always something another person gives us. Sometimes closure never comes. Sometimes the conversation never happens. Sometimes the apology never arrives. Sometimes accountability never appears. Sometimes the person who hurt us does not understand what they did. Sometimes they understand perfectly and choose not to address it. And sometimes we simply never know. And that is incredibly painful because human beings naturally want resolution. We want loose ends tied up. We want stories to make sense. We want explanations that fit the pain we experienced. We want someone to say, "You were right. I see it now. I'm sorry. You deserved better." But when those words never come, we can remain emotionally suspended, waiting, hoping, replaying, trying to solve a puzzle that may never be solved. I think many people, including myself, believe that closure is an event, one final conversation, one breakthrough moment, one explanation that suddenly makes everything okay. But what if closure is not an event? What if closure is a decision? What if closure begins when we stop demanding certainty before we allow ourselves to heal? And that doesn't mean your questions don't matter, because they do. It doesn't mean your pain isn't real, because it is. It doesn't mean what happened was acceptable. It wasn't. It simply means another person's explanation may not be what frees you. Sometimes we think, if I could just understand why they did it, I could move on. But often that isn't true, because understanding doesn't necessarily remove pain. Sometimes people understand exactly why something happened and still grieve it. It still hurts. You're still disappointed. You still wish things had been different. There are many people who've received apologies and still struggle to heal. And there are people who never received an apology and eventually found peace. Why? Because healing and closure are not always the same thing. Sometimes healing begins when we stop waiting for another person to participate, when we stop waiting for them to explain, stop waiting for them to validate our experience, stop waiting for them to become who we hoped they would be, stop waiting for them to provide the ending that we wanted. I know that sounds unfair, because it is. It is unfair. Some people should apologize. Some conversations should happen. Some truths should be acknowledged. Some relationships deserved honesty. Some endings deserved more dignity than they received. But acceptance is not agreement. Acceptance is not approval. Acceptance is not pretending it didn't matter. Acceptance is simply acknowledging reality as it exists, not as we wish it existed, not as we hoped it would exist, but as it actually exists. Sometimes the reality is the conversation is never coming, the explanation is never coming, the accountability is never coming, the closure is never coming. And as painful as that realization is, it can also be the beginning of freedom. Because once we stop waiting for what isn't coming, we can finally start building something else. A life, a future, a new chapter, peace. I think one of the most difficult griefs is grieving not only what happened, but what never happened. The apology that never came, the understanding that never came, the repair that never came, the relationship that never became what we hoped it would become. That is real grief, and it deserves to be acknowledged. Because there's also hope. Because your healing does not depend on another person's awareness. Your healing does not depend on another person's growth. Your healing does not depend on another person's apology. Your healing belongs to you. And God can do something beautiful with the story, even when some of the questions remain unanswered. Maybe closure isn't finally getting all the answers. Maybe closure is reaching the place where you no longer need them in order to move forward. Maybe closure is accepting that some chapters end with unanswered questions and choosing to live anyway, to heal anyway, to trust God anyway, to move forward anyway, even when closure never comes. Thank you for listening to The Reclaimed Life. If something in this episode resonated with you, you're not alone. Many people are beginning to recognize unhealthy patterns in relationships, systems, and environments, and discovering that reclaiming their voice is possible. In future episodes, I'll explore topics like recognizing manipulation, understanding narcissistic dynamics, rebuilding self-trust, and learning how to create a life that actually feels like your own. If you'd like to explore more of these ideas, you can visit my website at thereclaimedlifepodcast.com, where I share additional writing, resources, and future episodes of the show. Until next time, take a moment to listen to your intuition, trust what you're beginning to see, and remember that reclaiming your life often begins with one honest question. This is The Reclaimed Life.